Rupert Ross. Rupert also is known around the world for his work in restorative justice and also has written several books on the subject. And unlike Dr. Zare, who comes at it from an academic perspective, Rupert comes at it from within the system, the law enforcement and legal system. He served for most of his career as a Crown attorney for the Canadian government, and one of his assignments where he journeyed, and we're probably going to hear more about shortly, was his assignment was being a prosecutor through Indigenous tribes in Canada, where he discovered restorative justice. Rupert Ross.
Thanks, Chris. As Chris mentioned, most of my practice as the Canadian equivalent of a district attorney was with the Aboriginal people of Canada. And that's where I first was exposed to notions of Aboriginal justice. And Aboriginal justice in terms of justice as healing. So my perspective is wider than, well, maybe not Howard's. You're talking about healing widely dispersed, not just victim offender work. I usually start off presentations by telling a story of meeting with an elder who said in the middle of her teachings to a bunch of young people, she said, "I think I finally figured out what it means to live a good life." And I thought, this is going to be interesting because elders never tell people what to think or say or do. And she said, "I think you know you're living a good life when you look back 5 years or so and you find yourself saying, boy, I sure didn't know too much way back then." I have loved that, and I try to remind myself about it because one of the things I've learned from it is that if I would change my advice to myself every 5 years, why would I ever think of giving anybody else advice along the way? And so that's not what I'm here to do today. I want to do what I've learned from them, and that's to tell my stories. If you find them useful, that's wonderful. If you don't, that's all I can do. So I want to tell some stories, and they don't relate to the specifics of restorative justice in the sense of the particular kinds of cases or processes. They relate to what I see as the foundations of any restorative justice process. And I think they are regularly confused and people are regularly misled. I was led to my own understanding of it by my participation in all kinds of Aboriginal proceedings, during which I was given certain statements that made absolutely no sense to me. And I stored them all in my head thinking maybe someday they will make sense to me. I want to give you 3 of them because they later tied together to my understanding of Aboriginal healing as justice. The first was at a conference, and a woman talked about, we don't know how we can participate in your justice system when we see the world so differently. You, for instance, put mankind at the top of the hierarchy, underneath which is animals, underneath which is plants, underneath which is Mother Earth. That's not how we see things. We have Mother Earth at the top of our pyramid. Without Mother Earth, nothing else happens. Then there's the plant world. Then there's the animal world. And at the very bottom, there's just us, as human beings. And then she turned and said, so how could we possibly support your justice system? I said, I have no idea why you told me that, but I knew enough not to ask questions, just nod wisely and carry on my way. That was one. On another occasion, I was at a gathering of Aboriginal people talking about their relationship to science. And they raised the vision of an Aboriginal and a non-Aboriginal scientist both looking out at the meadow together. What did they each study? The non-Aboriginal scientist would look at a particular plant, pull it all apart, put names on all the parts of it, and figure out what they did and how they all worked together. And when he had it all done, he'd say, there, I understand that plant. The Aboriginal scientist, this guy said, she would, instead of just looking at the plant, would spend more time emphasizing the relationship with the other things that surrounded it, with the rains that came in, with the light that came at it, the bugs that came at it, the birds, the animals. And when she started to understand how they all work together, then she'd say, I think I have some knowledge of that plant and then of the meadow. And I got the same question. So when we see the world in this way, and we come at it this way, how can we possibly be part of your criminal justice system? I had no answer. So there was another puzzle that went up on what I thought of as my Indian puzzle shelf. The third one was an elder who's since passed away from the Kenora area where I live. lived. And at a break in a day's sessions, he came up to me and he said, "You're a lawyer. I got a question for you." He's a very direct elder. And he said, "You seem to think that law comes from books. That's not where law comes from. Law comes from," and he raised his arm across this set of windows that looked out onto the waters and the trees and the rocks on Lake of the Woods. He says, "That's where law comes from." And then he went away. And I said, I look out there and I see what I've been taught to see. I see Darwin. I see survival of the fittest. I see dog eat dog. And in my mind I'm going, isn't that what we have law for? To keep people from acting dog eat dog kind of ways to each other? And yet all of Alex's teachings were always about respect and love, and there's a whole series of teachings about that. So then, how does he look out there and see all that stuff as the law that he absorbs into his teachings about respect and courtesy and so forth? And so I stuck that up on my Indian puzzle shelf. There were about probably 50 of those events. I've just given you 3. They all started turning into coming together. One day when I gave a ride to an old Ojibwe woman who was hitchhiking, and just to make conversation with her, I said, "How are the blueberries this year?" And she, without hesitation, said, "Oh, I was out at the dump last night. There were 16 bears out there." And I knew what she was talking about, because if the blueberries are great, the bears are all back in the blueberry patches with big purple grins, and you never see them. If there's no blueberries, then they're all at the dump. So what started to hit me was I asked her a question about one thing, the blueberries, and she gave me an answer that never mentioned that thing. It only mentioned another thing, but it was a perfect answer. And I thought, it's only perfect if you know the relationship between those two things. And then I started thinking more about this notion of relationship. If her eye was going between things and assuming that I had the same eyes, that I also worked in relationships, was she seeing the world in a very different way from what I had been coming at it from? And I started taking that back into, say, those 3 things that I mentioned. And I looked at the notion of the reverse hierarchies, and I thought, if I have a reverse set of hierarchies so that mankind is at the bottom, then what we're talking about is relations of dependency. Everything depends upon, ultimately, Mother Earth. And as you go down that chain in the Western way of looking at it, where we're looking at things instead of relationships, the most important thing is us, because we've got power of mobility and speech and weapons, and we can kill ourselves, and it's just wonderful. So if you look at a thing world, when you're looking around, you're going to put us at the top. If you're looking at a relational world, you're looking at dependencies, and then we are the most dependent, and we're at the bottom. That seems to say something to me. Then I went to the 2 scientists who were looking, and that was very clear. One was looking at all the relationships around the plant in the meadow. It didn't understand the plant until it understood all the relationships. The 3rd thing, which one was that? I had quite a list of them here. The
law from nature.
Law from the books.
Yeah.
Darwin taught us dog eat dog. When he looked out there, he saw everything was sacred. Everything supported everything else. There was a duty of respect to all aspects out there, because although particular intimate parts might attack other parts for their own sustenance, so do we. Overall, everything had to be respected, because it was overall that health came. And so when all of these things came together, the notion of having what I thought of as a relational lens started to develop, where I thought, if I look at the world through whatever I can come up with as a relational lens, what changes? I'll give 4 cases that I show change. You asked the question, Howard, which is beautiful. What was the harm? Here's the first case. It's a woman walking down the street, and a guy runs past her and steals her purse. In the regular way of looking at it, it's a $20 theft. She got her cards back, blah, 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 no big deal. In the relational lens, what happened there was her relationships with the streets of her town changed phenomenally. When she walked down that street the next day, she felt fear. That had never happened before. Unless some process is in place to ask that question, what are the relational disfigurements that this crime has caused you, she will continue to have fear walking down that street. The relational lens made this a very different crime from what I thought it was. Another case I had with a kid walking down an alleyway, saw a bottle of rum sitting on a table inside some patio doors, went in and took it, never saw the people, they never saw him. Their relationship with their home changed phenomenally by this person they didn't know being in their home. When we brought them together, they could answer all kinds of questions. They could start to repair that relationship. The threat started to go down. We were trying to restore their relationship with their home. I did a bunch of work in a First Nations community that does fabulous processes on serious sexual abuse cases. And I was sitting in a healing circle there, and they were talking about the impact on victims of long-term sexual abuse. And one of the women said, my rape was 14 years ago. To this day, I still feel so dirty, I can't have my grandchildren sitting on my knee. I have to shoo them off, and they don't know why, and I can't tell them. And that struck me through the relational lens. What had been disfigured was her capacity for warm and healthy relationships with her children, with her family. Unless a process was put in place that explored that, that was going to stay forever. And we think we finish with a crime when the sentence is there and we do whatever. We haven't, if we haven't dealt with the relational thing. A second woman in that same circle said, geez, my rape was with her 18 years ago. And she said, to this day when I walk into someone else's bathroom at a party, I have to take the mirror and open it and close it to the wall because I can't stand to look at myself. And I thought, there's a person whose relationship with her own body, her own sense of self, has been disfigured so deeply that she's still stuck in this kind of a thing. So there, to me, is the definition of the harm. It's the disfigurement of the relationships that nourish us, that make us whole human beings. Our present system, A, only deals with offenders, B, doesn't talk about relationships, C, defines everything in terms of things, whether it's restitution, compensation, time in jail, hours of community service. That's all we do. We don't talk about the relational disfigurement and trying to restore that. That's what restorative justice can do. And if it's taken broader than just victim-offender reconciliation, it can make a powerful difference in the lives of everybody engaged in it, especially people like me sitting there being a part of it. I've cried so many times. It's a fabulous process. Thank you.